Okay, go ahead and take out your articles of faith. We're currently article number 23 on the paper. We are focusing on Christian stewardship. We're on that fourth paragraph where it says, we believe the Holy Ghost gives resources individually to each believer to faithfully manage. God has given the Christian liberty in how to use those resources in this management. The Christian's primary duty is to first properly manage and maintain their own household first. Secondly, to help manage and maintain the body of Christ. Then as they are able to propagate the gospel with their properly managed and maintained resources. And so we know the importance of properly managing resources. We want to be careful of those type of people who cause you to want to be spurious in the moment about resources that God has given to you. Yes, there are times when we want to use our resources when an emergency comes up, an emergency happens. We want to be charitable. We want to be giving in those times of need, but we don't want to give to every single thing that comes along that is always a surprise and nobody ever expected it. You have to prepare for those things. Just like a church has a parking lot, they should not be surprised that that parking lot needs repair or breaks, or if somebody has people coming to their church, they should not be surprised that they needed insurance to pay the insurance bill, the light bill, the water bill. Those are not surprises. Those are not emergencies. If those are always coming up and showing up, it means that something is not being properly managed. And then the same way with the officers of the church. The officers of the church should know and expect what to expect from the church and what to expect money-wise, management-wise, resource-wise. The church cannot have a vision beyond its means, if you will. Yes, it's an ideal thing. Yes, one day we would like to support 10,000 missionaries with each one supported $5,000 a month and all these things, but that's not practical for a church of 3 or 4 or 5 plus people to do. You know, small churches can do little. People with one talent can only use one talent of resource. And so they neither are called to hide it away, nor are they called to have a 10 talent vision for a 1 talent resource. But of course, you know, if you have 1 talent and you know how to properly manage that, one day you can have 10 talents. You can eventually have that resource. But the thing is that if you are mismanaging your funds at a very early stage, whether you're the church in general or the officers of the church, then you will not have funds to manage in the later stage. And so you have to, even though we desire to have things right away, we must manage them properly. And so here in this passage, we have finished up with our previous passages were in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We looked at those. Now we're going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9 through 10. So 2 chapters here, chapters 9 and 10 of 2 Corinthians. And of course, the Church of Corinth, they spent a lot of time with 2 letters talking about issues of the church and the needs of the church. So oftentimes people forget the practical aspects and the practical needs of a church, that they want to be ultra spiritual or hyper delusional, if you want to call it that. And so we need to realize that he says, you know, you need to count the cost of things. But here in this passage, of course, we've been talking about different topics of stewardship, and then also about, here in this section, is managing your resources in regards to church officers. And you're not only just managing your resources, but even if you can't afford to pay a church officer, that officer needs to know where to get his income from. You're like Paul the Apostle writing these words. He was a tent maker. He did not rely solely on funds of a church, but he also realized that if the ministry of the gospel was able to, it ought to support its ministers. And so that was important. Just as Hebrews talks about how that the priests live after the temple, and also this passage, so that we need to realize that the ministers of the gospel don't just work for free. And so this is an important thing to understand. Now, obviously, the ministers of the gospel have a choice. They can willingly work for free so that the gospel be not hindered. And so that's an important distinction to make. People forget that, hey, just because the pastor is working for free doesn't mean that that pastors should not be paid. And so it is a decision that the church is obligated to pay their pastor, but the pastor is also willingly able, if he is able, to decline payment for his services, if you will. And so oftentimes people make that mistake and think, well, the ministers, it's a ministry, not a job, and therefore, I as the church member or the church in general don't have to pay my pastor. No, you have to pay your ministers, but the ministers can willingly decline. And there's a good reason for that. We do that is that though it is something that I could ask of you or demand of you, if you will, I know that if I demanded of it, the gospel ministry would be hard because you're unable to pay. And so that's an important distinction to make. Here, Paul the Apostle is making that distinction. He, as a tent maker, paid for his own way so that he could minister to those people while they were unable to give of their ministry. So he says here in verse 1, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord?" He's saying, hey, I've ministered, I work hard, and I saved you guys. I have this ministry of the Lord. I have been given this, and are you not my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. He's saying here, hey, even though, obviously we don't pay, just because somebody's a pastor on TV, we don't pay them. We're not obligated to those people. They may or may not be official pastors, somebody way in distant lands. But we know one thing. The pastor who ministers among us, whether it's here as the apostle, starting churches, a missionary pastor, or a church planting pastor, or somebody going to a place for free, though those members are not obligated to other people, they have an obligation, a debt to pay to the minister that ministered to them, that worked among them. And so here it says, if I be not an apostle unto others, so even if people in distant lands think, oh, Paul the Apostle is not really an apostle, that's not the discussion. Here they're saying, well, I don't need to minister to Paul the Apostle. He says, well, you can argue about whether I'm a minister to other people, but you know for sure I'm a minister to you because I saved you. I converted you. I helped you see the light. I converted you in the Lord. So you are my work in the Lord. And he's using these work terms, though oftentimes we don't like to speak in those terms. He's using these work terms to help them get a shift in their mind, to help them understand that, hey, you need to, though I'm not going to be here as an apostle, when you have officers in the church ministering in you, among you, don't send your money out to televangelists. Don't worry about all other people. You know I did the work for you here, so what are you going to do for me? How to help me? If I be not an apostle unto others, yea, doubtless I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. If Paul the apostle is not an apostle, if he's a false believer, then so too are they. If Paul is teaching error, if Paul is not a true minister, and if they don't have an obligation to Paul, then Paul had no obligation to them. So yes, Paul had an obligation he gave to the Lord Jesus Christ, so he gave the ministry, he ministered to them and reconciled them to God, and he worked for them, and therefore they have an obligation to him. So it's a two-way street. If the pastor ministers to you, you have an obligation to minister to the pastor. Though the pastor ministers spiritually, you have an obligation for physical. The pastor has an abundance, because of study and the office that he's been given, of spiritual knowledge and wisdom to convey to the community. But in the effort of doing that, it takes a lot of effort to convert that spiritual energy into the spoken word, and therefore it takes resources. It takes physical resources to be able to do that. And the church, having physical resources, not just one individual or two individuals, but as a group whole, has physical resources because of work and daily life and things that they have, and then they are able to convert their physical resources into the spiritual ministry through supporting their spiritual conduit. And that is Paul the Apostle, that is their pastor, that is a full-time Christian minister. This could be all the way from an apostle, like Paul the Apostle here, also to your pastor, and also to the local janitor who's spending time cleaning your church building. As buildings get big and physical, then they need somebody to clean the buildings. And eventually, it can't all be done by physical workers. One person does a poor job of cleaning this restroom, another person does a good job on that, another one just because their ability is unable to do this. And so you want a consistency, and it's better to support one individual to do that consistently. Now, it's similar to where a school would hire a full-time janitor versus making their kids do all the work. Oh, hey kids, there's a light bulb that needs to be changed in the classroom. Change that light bulb out. No, kids do it. They could. In Japan, a lot of times they have a lot of these things delegated to children and stuff as part of their education. So yeah, it can be done, but we found oftentimes to get the compliance and the safety, a kid running around with a ladder is not very safe necessarily, and so you want to have a janitor who's consistent. You want to have somebody who's consistent, and especially in some of these churches, you see some of these ceilings are so very high that you don't want to just anybody running around doing that. You want to have somebody who has the knowledge and the skills and the ability, which takes effort and time, to be able to do those things. And so if you want, you can have volunteer pastors, you can have volunteer workers, and a lot of ministries have run that way. But they're very small, they're very manageable for a part-time laborer. But when you want to actually do something large and physical, you have to put in the effort and the time to do it, just like anything in life. So if I be not, he says, mine answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat and drink? Oh, you don't need to pay the pastor. Well, doesn't the pastor need to be able to eat and drink just like anybody else? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles? Aren't your pastor allowed to have a family? Isn't your pastor allowed to take care of their loved ones? You wouldn't neglect your own loved ones, would you? The pastor, he has loved ones, he has family members, he has to take care of those people. He has to be able to eat and drink those physical things. Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? It says, look at how everybody else does it. Not just because I'm a missionary, or just because I'm a pastor, or just because I'm a janitor, or a full-time Christian worker in some other area, doesn't mean that I'm going to be doing these things for free. I eventually have to support myself, whether as a tent maker or some other way. There has to be some means of supporting that person. Or I only and Barnabas have not we the power to forbear working? Who goeth to warfare at any time, warfare at any time at his own charges? Oh yeah, it's important to be patriotic and to support your country and defend your country with all that you have. But fighting takes weapons. It takes defense. It has fortresses. It has things that need to be paid for. And who's going to pay for those things? The taxpayer, of course. The taxpayer. Oh, but it's your patriotic duty to support and defend your country. Well, who's going to feed that soldier? The taxpayer. So who's going to support their church officers? The churches. So it's the same way. Everything in life is like this. A company pays a person to do a job. They're not going to do that job for free. The Lord charges people to be in full-time ministry, but they can't do it for free. Now, sometimes they give opportunities to labor, but then, see, when I have to work 40 plus hours at a full-time job, which I have no problem doing, then those 40 plus hours are no longer 40 plus hours for the ministry. And now it's 20 plus or less hours for the ministry rather than 40 plus hours for the ministry. So that laborer is going to have to come up with that support some way, somehow. Who goeth for warfare at any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Oh, you grow this vineyard and you're never going to eat the fruit. You save a soul, but you're never going to get help saving souls. That labor has to come from somewhere. Or who feedeth the flock, and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Saith these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? So we need to understand that if you labor in something, if it's important to you enough, you want to focus your energies onto it, that thing has to give you a return. Whether it's spiritual or physical, your labor has to have a return somewhere. And this is what Paul is making clear here, is that he can't just, if he were to be full-time in tent making, where would his preaching, where would his pastoring, where would his church planting, where would his, all that ministry-wise? The time has to come from somewhere. And he can't just do all the tent making. He also can't just do all ministry unless they wish for him to do all the ministry. And so a lot of times they come up with this idea, well, the pastor needs to be 24/7 on call right away. He shouldn't have received the office if he's not able to do it. Yeah, but are you paying him to be 24 hours on call? Are you doing those things for him? The pastor didn't come see me in the hospital. Well, pastor had to work. Pastor had to support his family. Pastor had to do it. You can't have a 24/7 full-time, 25/7, 8 days a week type of pastor. You have to have that time come from somewhere. Say these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth not God take care for oxen? Or saith it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partakers of his hope. A person who ministers desires to minister in that area. A pastor wants to be full-time. He ought to want to be full-time. I have a concern about a pastor who doesn't want to be full-time. Well, I just do it on the side. I just kind of, the Lord's ministry is not good enough for you, that you prefer secular work to ministry work? Well, yeah, I just preach a couple sermons, give a couple of thoughts, and then we move about our day. That's not the desire of a pastor. He wants to be full-time in that labor. He wants to labor in hope. He wants to be able to one day be full-time. He wants to one day be able to focus all of his energies on one thing that can not only help him, but also so that he can focus more for the Lord's ministry. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, it is a great thing if we reap of your carnal things. If others be partakers of this power over you, are you not rather? You call a plumber up. You ask a plumber, hey, come fix my leaky pipes. Plumber fixes leaky pipes. Oh, I don't need to pay you. You did this to be nice to me. I don't need to pay you. The pipes aren't leaking anymore, so why do I need a plumber? Well, I fixed your pipes. Well, no. Well, you can go fix somebody else's pipes. You don't need to. You don't have to fix mine anymore. It's the same logic that we use to pastors. Well, your labor is only spiritual. No, it takes physical energy. It takes physical energy to focus on these things, to take time to focus on ministry, and you expect a pastor to go out full time in the field, and then also to labor for his family, and then to write 4 or 5 sermons a week, and all these things. It's not an easy task. And to neglect in paying, or to say that you have no duty in the matter, is negligence. It's negligence. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. So we have this power, just like the government would tax you and then charge you and take your land if you don't pay your taxes, and they would charge you for those things. Why? Because they are ministering on your behalf. Oh, that soldier shouldn't be forcing me to pay my taxes. That sheriff shouldn't be forcing me to pay my taxes. Well, that sheriff isn't just there to take your money. A lot of times you hear that comment, oh yeah, well those pastors are just there to take your money. Well, yeah, some charlatan on TV maybe somewhere, but somebody who's doubtless ministering among you, that their labor in the Lord, he's not out there to take your money. But it's the same way with the sheriff or the police officer or any civil servant. They're doing it as a service. They're a civil servant, and they're a minister on our behalf. But they can't do it for free, and therefore they will take what they need. They will take what they need. But here's the things. It says, nevertheless, we have not used this power. We can demand it, but we have not used this power. Most pastors that I know of do not demand of their congregation a paycheck. They request it, they ask for it. That's part of the deal, depending on what your size of your church. But nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. The Bible talks about how being suffered to be defrauded, to allow things to happen to you for the ministry. It's our right to receive a paycheck, but oftentimes we don't ask for one because it would hinder the gospel of Christ. It would hinder the gospel of Christ. If I were to say, hey, okay, we get so many tithes, this, right now it's just like not very much. There's only a few families tithing. But if I were to say, okay, your first and primemost obligation is to pay me, I'm going to take all the tithes. Then what would happen? Pretty soon the building would fall apart. Pretty soon it would just not work out because we can't afford it. The light bill wouldn't be paid. We'd be meeting in a field somewhere, because the church burnt down because it wasn't safe. And why? Because I demanded my tithe. I demanded my pay. And that wouldn't be healthy. It would have harmed the ministry. I know it's important that at the beginning, when we're young and slow, that money has come from somewhere else other than the field. But it's just like a farmer. When they're sowing seeds, they cannot demand a harvest before they sow the seeds. It's the same way. But once that harvest comes, the produce must come. That oxen, once it treadeth the corn, should receive of the corn. The same way with the other thing, who feedeth the flock, and eateth not the milk thereof. So you have to feed the flock first, then you eat of the milk. Same way with a minister. He has to minister and grow the church before he can receive a tithe. And so there's that obvious sowing first. He sows first, and then you minister to him back. It's not the other way around. Well, I'm not going to minister unless they pay me first. No, it doesn't work that way. If others be partakers, do you not know that they which minister about the holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Just as in the Jewish system, and just as in the Israelite system, that temple didn't take care of itself. The Levites didn't minister on their own. They had to get tithes. The tithes were meant for their pay. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So we see here that they are ordained to preach the gospel and live of the gospel. So if you're a preacher of the gospel, you should live of the gospel. And so and notice here also as well, this goes into tithing later on, is that it says, do you not know that they which minister about the holy things live of the things of the temple? How did they live of the things of the temple? By the tithe. By Israel giving a physical tithe. And they which are at the altar, partakers with the altar. How were they able to get food and meat? By sacrifices. And part of that sacrifice wasn't wholly burned up necessarily, but it was the bread and the meat was part of their payment for offering that sacrifice. They partook in it. Even so hath the Lord ordained. So just as they receive a tithe, just as Old Testament Israel, Levites, and the temple received a tithe, so too Christian ministers ought to receive a tithe. They ought to receive of the church. He says, even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. How? Even so, which the even so is referring back to verse 13. And so that tithe, of the tithe that's supposed to take care of the temple, is also supposed to take care of the ministers. And so even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I have used none of these things. What things? Requiring a tithe, sowing and reaping, requiring an offering, requiring they minister to him after he's ministered to them. Neither have I written these things that it should be so done unto me. I'm not writing, and most pastors are this way when they preach on tithing. They're not preaching on tithing just so that they can get a paycheck. People already know that I'm not getting a paycheck, and I don't really care to get a paycheck, especially at this time. I do not want to eventually get a paycheck just for my sake, but rather for the church's sake, so that they properly are maintaining, after I'm passed or gone away from this church, that they are properly focusing on the ministers that come. I writ these things that it should be so done, neither have I written these things that it should be so done unto me, for it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. Paul would rather not get paid. I would rather not get paid. If I could freely do this without having to do anything else, I would go and do it. If I was free to do this with no other obligation, then that's what I would do. I wouldn't require a paycheck. Some people do it because it's a job. Other people, like Paul the Apostle, did it because it was his ministry, it was his call from the Lord, but he realized that he and other pastors and people would need to be able to receive subsistence, food, raiment, clothing, but it would have to come from somewhere, and then just as everything else in life comes from those that you minister to or work in, so too it must be received from them. Even with the tithe and the offering of the Levites, so too it would be the tithe and the offering to ministers. And when we went through Leviticus a while back in the other church, is that we focused on the tithe on that aspect. But it says, I have used none of these things. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. It's something that we're going to do regardless. If I have to pay for my way, then I will. But if I can get ministry from the church, that's wonderful. But if I have to do secular work and preach on the side, then that's what I'm going to do. For woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. So here, notice there he says, for if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. So I'm going into a place that can support me and pay my job. I'm doing it willingly. I'm happy. That's all I'm doing. I'm focusing on that. I have a reward for the ministry. It's wonderful. He says, but if against my will, in other words, I don't want to, I have to go somewhere else to get my pay. I have to go do it as Paul did, mend a tent. He has to go fix a roof or do some other thing other than the ministry against his will. But the thing is, the dispensation of the gospel is committed unto him. He has to find a way to preach the gospel because it's something not that he's getting paid to do, but because something that God commissioned him to do. And so he has to do it. What is the reward then? For doing this for free, basically? That when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. So he wants to make sure that first and foremost, the gospel ministry takes precedent over his necessities. So the reason why it's easy for churches to get somebody, a pastor, I mean, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. We realize that, of course, it's not easy to somebody, hey, we have this beautiful building, come and minister to us. A lot of people don't want to do that if there's no money involved. There's no support check. We've had people even say, hey, we'll come for free, but then they get here and nope, this came up, that came up, and we're not supporting ourselves, and therefore we need this money from the church or that money from the church. There was false pretenses. We need to be very careful of that, that when we go someplace and say, hey, we're going to do this without charge, and all of a sudden you're charging for this, charging for that, and you got to be very careful with that. And so he says here that I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. So notice here that you are not necessarily paying him to preach the gospel. You are paying him to minister while he's preaching the gospel, paying him to help you guys. But he's going to be preaching the gospel regardless. So whether you pay the pastor or whether you don't pay the pastor, that person who's doing it for free is going to do it regardless, and he's going to be glad to do it because it's not for you that he's doing it for the Lord. But in order to support himself, the Lord has commissioned and ordained that he receive something from the church. But he's not going to do it to the abuse of the gospel. So we as a church need to support our pastors so they can do the ministry, but the pastor is not to abuse his power in the ministry to cause harm to the ministry. And so, for example, if the church cannot pay me, I'm willingly going to suffer that harm to me, and I'm going to find another way to support myself so that the ministry can continue regardless of where my support comes from. And so that's our goal as a minister and church. The church is obligated to pay when they can and as they're able, and then the minister is obligated to Christ to minister regardless of where their income comes from. For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself a servant unto all, that I might gain the more. So notice this, a lot of times people say, well, the pastor is, because he's fulfilling our office of the church, is an employee of the church. He's not your employee. He's your minister. But the thing is that you do not force him to become your slave or your servant. He is free from all men, but he is willingly submitting himself to be your minister. Notice here, for though I be free from all men, yet he has no obligation to them because they're not paying him especially, yet I have made myself a servant unto all. He's doing this for free. He became your servant under his free will. It's his freedom to minister in that way. Though he's not free, he's not obligated to you for anything, he is free. Unto all that I might gain the more. So, yeah, when you get paid, you're obligated to continue in that relationship. But if you're doing it for free, you're free of all men, yet you're doing it through willing service on your part, not the church's part. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So he's talking about how that he is focusing on the ministry of Christ regardless, and if he is focusing on ministry to Jewish people, he's going to do things that are going to make sure not to abuse them. So he's going to eat the right foods, he's going to go to the right rituals, he's going to do all those things for the Jewish people. Why? Because those things are important to them, and he's not going to abuse the gospel ministry because he is offended in some way. Same way with the Gentiles. He's going to minister to them the gospel. He's not going to harm the gospel. Just as I'm not going to harm the gospel for a paycheck, so too I'm not going to harm the gospel under my feigned conformity to some sort of custom or rule. To them that are under the law as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So those who are not paying me, I'm still going to minister to you. Those who are Jewish, I'm still going to minister to you. Those who are Gentiles, I'm still going to minister to you. Those who are under the law, those who are lawbreakers, I'm still going to minister to you. It doesn't matter your situation in life or whether you can do for me, I'm going to minister to you. To them that are without the law, as without the law, being not without law to God, but rather under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might gain the weak. I am all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So just as he is all things to all men for different situations, he's going to be the same thing with somebody who's able to pay him, a church that can pay him, and he's going to be the same thing to a church that cannot pay him. He's not going to change because the ministry is important to him. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. Know ye not that ye which run in a way shall run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they that do it to obtain a corruptible crown, we an incorruptible. Therefore so run as uncertainty, so fight as I not one that beateth the air, but I keep under my body to bring it unto subjection, lest by any means, whereof I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. So what he's saying here is basically, church, it's your obligation to pay the ministers that minister among you. But it is not and it is the minister's obligation, power, if you will, power to demand of you a paycheck to support them. But it is because of the Spirit of Christ that we neglect or do not abuse this power. We do not demand this power because it could abuse the gospel. And so if anything, whether a paycheck could come between me and ministering in the gospel, I don't want the paycheck. If being under the law, as a Jewish person under the law, could come between me and ministering the gospel to that person, I don't want the paycheck. If it is a Jewish person or a lawbreaker, I want to be able to minister to that person. So I don't want to let anything come in between me and you, is what he's saying here. So whether he's free to receive a paycheck or not is no difference to him whether or not he will preach the gospel. Verily that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. The important thing is that whether you get paid, you don't get paid, regardless of who you minister to, you do not abuse that power to hurt the gospel, but we do everything to help the gospel. So we as a church needs to realize that the reason why we pay our ministers is to help the gospel. How often times that if you refuse to pay your minister and he's laboring among you and trying to support his family, how often times will he not be able to minister in the gospel? It is therefore, because he's not taking a paycheck to abuse the gospel, so too we as a church, as a whole, need to minister to our pastor and our ministers and our full-time Christian workers so that we do not abuse the gospel and hindering the advancement of the local church in moving forward in the gospel. And so we pay the ministers to move forward the gospel, not abuse our power. The ministers don't receive a paycheck through their free will so that they do not abuse the ministry. So in either side of the thing, we don't want to harm or abuse the power of the gospel to go forward. And that's what our paycheck does for the minister, is to move him forward. That's what he, working for free, moves the gospel forward. If we can support him, can go full-time in ministry and to bring that gospel further together, partakers with you together, moving forward rather than pulling each other back. So let's do what we can in our ministry. The spiritual minister being able to minister full-time, and the church being able to support their pastor full-time is the best way to move the gospel forward without abusing or harming our ministry. So let's focus on that. Next week we'll look at 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this passage. Thank you for the opportunity to consider your word, Lord. I just pray that you'll just help us to realize the importance of ministering physically to our spiritual ministers, Lord. Help us to look for that balance, look for the right way to do that, and to not harm the church or the gospel ministry in doing so, but we, facing our obligations head on, realize and embrace them and enjoy them so that we can bring forward the gospel without abuse. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.